The storm outside had rolled in without warning, smothering the last streaks of twilight. Rain lashed against the windows of the secluded family home, perched on the edge of a dense forest. Inside, the dim glow of a single-floor lamp pooled over the living room, illuminating mismatched furniture and the faint outlines of two figures. Claire adjusted her sweater as she sank into the deep cushions of the couch, her eyes flickering to the clock on the mantel. It was only 7, but the house already felt heavy with stillness, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the clock and the occasional groan of wind through the trees. She hadn't expected to be here tonight, least of all alone with Liam. Her younger brother sat sprawled in the armchair across the room, one leg draped casually over the armrest, a glass of soda in his hand. The faint light caught the sharp angles of his jaw, his face softened by a faint smile that seemed unshakably easy. He was always like this, unbothered, untethered by the gravity of things. It annoyed her sometimes, how he could move through life so lightly. Tonight it made her uneasy. "This storm's something," Liam said, breaking the silence. His voice was low and unhurried, like he didn't mind the quiet. "Feels like we're stuck in one of those old mystery novels Mom loves." Claire gave a small, distracted laugh, her fingers curling tighter around the throw blanket draped over her lap. "Yeah, except I doubt anyone's coming to the rescue if we get snowed in." He tilted his head toward her, the smile tugging wider. "You'd survive. You always do." That comment, light and seemingly innocent, struck a chord deeper than she cared to admit. Survive. That's what she'd been doing lately. Navigating the wreckage of a failing marriage, balancing work stress, and trying to ignore the aching loneliness that had settled into her chest like a permanent tenant. She hadn't wanted to come here for the weekend, but when their parents had called, asking her to house-sit while they attended a last-minute event, she'd reluctantly agreed. Liam showing up had been an afterthought. "What about you?" she asked, trying to shift the attention away from herself. "You're usually out with your friends or on some road trip. Why were you here?" He shrugged, taking a sip of his drink. "Plans fell through. Figured I'd come keep you company." There it was again, that casual charm that put her on edge tonight. She pressed her lips together, unsure how to respond. There had always been an easy bond between them, even as kids. But now there was something different, an almost imperceptible shift in the air between them. "So," Liam said, leaning forward slightly, his expression shifting from playful to curious. "How's everything? Work, life, the husband?" Claire stiffened at the mention of Mark, her estranged husband. "Fine," she said too quickly. "Busy?" Liam raised an eyebrow, a knowing look settling over his face. "That's not what Mom said last time I talked to her." Claire's cheeks flushed, a mix of irritation and embarrassment blooming in her chest. "Mom needs to learn when to keep things to herself." He chuckled softly, the sound low and warm. "Hey, don't shoot the messenger. Just making conversation." Silence stretched between them again, the weight of unsaid things settling over the room. Claire's gaze drifted to the storm outside, watching the rain streak down the glass like tiny rivers. She didn't want to talk about Mark, didn't want to unpack the years of distance, the quiet resentment that had grown like a weed between them. She especially didn't want to discuss it with Liam, who had always been more observant than he let on. "You don't have to pretend, you know," Liam said suddenly, his voice softer now. "Not with me." She turned back to him, startled by the quiet sincerity in his tone. "I'm not pretending." He gave her a pointed look, one that made her feel exposed in a way she wasn't used to. "Sure you're not." Claire felt her defenses rising, her instinct to deflect and shut down the conversation kicking in. But something about his expression stopped her. It wasn't mocking or condescending. It was patient, almost gentle. "I'm fine, Liam," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "Really?" He didn't push, didn't press her for more like others might have. Instead, he leaned back in the chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "Okay," he said simply. The simplicity of his response caught her off guard, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to being let off the hook so easily. Thanks, she murmured, her fingers tightening around the blanket. Liam nodded, his gaze softening. Any time. The storm continued to rage outside, but the tension in the room had shifted, the sharp edges dulled by something quieter, something unspoken. For a moment, Claire allowed herself to relax, the warmth of the blanket and the soft glow of the lamp wrapping around her like a cocoon. But as she glanced back at Liam, her guard slipped just enough for her to notice something, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual easy smile. Claire told herself she imagined it. Want to watch something? Liam asked, breaking the moment with a casualness that felt almost deliberate. She nodded, grateful for the distraction. You pick. As he reached for the remote, Claire leaned back into the couch, her gaze drifting once again to the rain-soaked window. The unease she'd felt earlier hadn't disappeared. It had only buried itself deeper, settling somewhere she couldn't quite reach. For now, it would stay there, hidden beneath layers of polite conversation and forced smiles. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't stay hidden forever. The house had grown quieter as the night deepened. The steady rhythm of the rain remained the only sound, tapping against the roof like a persistent metronome. The storm hadn't let up, and neither had the strange tension lingering in the air between Claire and Liam. Claire sat curled on the couch, a mug of tea warming her hands. The movie they'd picked was playing on the TV, but she hadn't registered a single scene. Her gaze drifted occasionally toward Liam, who was stretched out on the floor with his back propped against the armchair. He seemed engrossed in the film, but there was a subtle awareness in his posture, as if he was waiting for her to speak. The quiet between them had shifted into something heavier, though Claire couldn't pinpoint when or how. It was as if every word, every glance carried more weight than it should. Are you even watching? Liam asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. Claire blinked, startled out of her thoughts. What? The movie, he said, tilting his head toward the screen. You've been staring at that tea like it's going to give you life advice. She let out a soft laugh, setting the mug on the coffee table. Sorry. Guess I'm just distracted. By what? His tone was light, teasing, but his eyes, dark and steady, held an intensity that unsettled her. She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. Nothing important. He shifted slightly, leaning his head back against the chair. You've been acting weird all night, you know. I have not, she protested, though the heat rising in her cheeks betrayed her. You have, he insisted. His tone was playful, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Is it me? Did I do something? No, she said quickly, perhaps too quickly. It's not you. Then what is it? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Come on, Claire. Talk to me. I'm not going to bite. The way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine, though she wasn't sure why. She wanted to brush him off, to tell him it didn't matter, but the way he was looking at her made it impossible to hide. It's just everything, she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Work's a mess, Mark and I aren't exactly on the best terms, and honestly, I don't even know why I'm telling you this. Liam's expression softened, and for a moment, he looked older than his years. Because you need to tell someone, he said simply. She let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, well, you're not exactly the first person I'd think to talk to about my problems. Ouch, he said, clutching his chest dramatically. Way to wound a guy. I didn't mean it like that, she said quickly, guilt twisting in her stomach. I don't want to drag you into my mess. He waved her off. Claire, you've been dragging me into your mess since the day I was born. Remember when you used to make me sneak cookies out of the pantry for you? Or when you convinced me to lie to Mom about breaking her vase? She couldn't help but smile at the memory. You're not seriously comparing that to this. Why not? Same principle. Big sister screws up, little brother helps clean up the mess. His grin was infectious, and for a moment, Claire felt the weight on her chest lift. But then his expression shifted, becoming more serious. Look, he said, his voice softer now. I know I'm not exactly an expert on relationships or any of that, but if you need someone to talk to, I'm here. No judgment, no strings attached. There was something disarming about his sincerity, something that made her want to let her guard down even though she knew she shouldn't. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in a long time she felt truly seen. Thanks, she said quietly. That means a lot. They fell into silence again, but it wasn't the awkward kind. It was a comfortable stillness, like they were sharing the same unspoken understanding. Claire reached for her mug, the tea now lukewarm, and took a sip. You know, Liam said after a while, you don't have to stay in a situation that makes you miserable. She froze, her fingers tightening around the mug. It's not that simple. Why not? He asked, his voice steady but not unkind. Because it's complicated, she said, frustration creeping into her tone. Mark and I have been together for years. You don't just walk away from that. But if it's not working. I said it's complicated, she snapped, cutting him off. Liam held up his hands in surrender. Okay. Sorry. I didn't mean to overstep. Claire let out a breath, her anger dissolving as quickly as it had come. No, I'm sorry, she said. I shouldn't have snapped at you. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She tried to blink them away, but Liam noticed. Hey, he said gently, moving to sit on the couch beside her. It's okay. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. The proximity was unexpected, and for a moment, Claire was hyper-aware of how close he was. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. Liam, It's okay, he said again, cutting her off but not unkindly. I'm not going anywhere. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Claire's heart raced, and she wasn't sure if it was from the conversation or the way he was looking at her. She wanted to say something to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. The movie on the TV played on, forgotten, as the storm outside continued to rage. The power went out just before midnight. The sudden darkness swallowed the room, leaving Claire and Liam sitting in silence, illuminated only by the pale flashes of lightning from the storm outside. The hum of the TV was gone, the faint background noise that had masked the undercurrent of tension between them, now replaced by the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Well, that's ominous, Liam said, his voice breaking the quiet. Claire let out a shaky laugh, her pulse quickening. Guess we're really stuck now. Liam stood, the faint outline of his figure moving toward the window. Storm's not letting up any time soon, he said, his tone unreadable. Claire remained on the couch, gripping the edge of the blanket draped over her lap. She tried to focus on the storm, the lightning illuminating the trees outside, but her attention kept drifting to him. His silhouette was sharp against the pale light, a faint reflection of his face visible in the glass. This reminds me of when we were kids, Liam said, still staring out into the night. Remember that blizzard when the power went out? We camped in the living room with all those blankets. Yeah, Claire said, her voice quieter than she intended. Mom made us hot cocoa, and Dad told us ghost stories until we fell asleep. He turned to face her, his expression difficult to read in the dim light. Feels different now, doesn't it? Her breath caught at his words, and she couldn't bring herself to answer. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the storm had somehow crept inside. Liam crossed the room and sat beside her on the couch, his movements deliberate but unhurried. Claire's heart raced as she felt the cushion shift under his weight. He was close, too close, and yet she didn't move away. You've been quiet, he said softly. What's on your mind? She shook her head, forcing a weak smile. Just the storm. It's a lot. He studied her, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. It's not just the storm, he said gently. Is it? Claire opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat felt tight, her thoughts a tangled mess. She didn't know what to say, what she could say, that wouldn't make things worse. Claire, Liam said, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to do this alone. She turned to him, her eyes meeting his. There was something in his gaze, something raw and unguarded, that made her chest ache. For a moment, she wanted to believe him, to let herself lean into the comfort he offered. But it wasn't that simple. You don't understand, she said finally, her voice trembling. It's not just about me. It's about everything. Mark, my job, this weight I can't get rid of. I do understand, he said, his voice steady. More than you think. His words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Claire looked away, her eyes focusing on the faint outline of the coffee table in front of them. She felt his presence beside her, the warmth of his body so close to hers, and it made her feel both comforted and trapped. You shouldn't have to carry all of that by yourself, he said, his tone gentle but firm. Let someone help you. Let me help you. Her breath hitched at his words, and she turned back to him, her eyes searching his face for some hint of insincerity. But there was none. He meant every word, and that terrified her. Liam, she began, her voice barely audible. This isn't right. Why not, he asked, his tone calm but insistent. Because it's not, she said, her voice breaking. You're my brother. This isn't. It's not supposed to be like this. He leaned closer, his gaze unwavering. Who decides what's supposed to be? We're not just siblings, Claire. We're two people who understand each other in a way no one else does. Her chest tightened, her thoughts racing as his words sank in. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but a part of her, the part she'd been trying to ignore all night, knew he wasn't. This is crazy, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Maybe, he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. But sometimes crazy is what we need. The room seemed to close in around them, the storm outside fading into the background. Claire felt the pull between them, an invisible thread tightening with every passing second. She knew she should stop this, should put distance between them, but her body refused to move. Liam reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The contact was light, almost tentative, but it sent a jolt through her, a spark she couldn't ignore. Tell me to stop, he said, his voice low and steady. She stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. The words were on the tip of her tongue, but they wouldn't come. She didn't want to say them. Claire, he said again, his tone softer now. If this isn't what you want, just say the word. Her breath caught, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. She looked into his eyes, saw the vulnerability there, the quiet plea he wasn't saying out loud. But she couldn't. The room felt impossibly still, the air heavy with the weight of their silence. And then, as if propelled by something beyond her control, she leaned in, closing the distance between them. The moment their lips met, the world seemed to blur, the storm outside fading into nothing. It was wrong, and yet it felt inevitable, like they'd been circling this moment all night. When they finally pulled apart, Claire's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of which she could hold on to. She looked at Liam, his expression mirroring the mix of guilt and longing she felt. We can't, she said, her voice trembling. I know, he said, his voice barely audible. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like a shroud. Claire stood abruptly, wrapping the blanket tightly around herself as if it could shield her from the reality of what she'd done. I need to go to bed, she said, her voice shaky. Liam didn't try to stop her, didn't say anything as she hurried out of the room. But as she climbed the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest, she knew that what had happened tonight would change everything.